I'm happy to welcome you to the third of 5 elder conversations. I'm Doris Malkmus. I'm the archivist with LGBTQ Religious Archive Network. LGBTQ-RAN is an online project which fosters the preservation of LGBTQ religious movements through encouraging and supporting activists and organizations to donate their records to an archive. Under the motto, "History is written by those who preserve their records," LGBTQ-RAN provides information on our website about LGBTQ persons from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. The website features hundreds of biographical sketches, dozens of oral histories, as well as original historical exhibitions. LGBTQ-RAN is celebrating the accomplishments of its first 20 years with a Queering Our Roots campaign, honoring 5 elders of the religious movements in the US. Today, we present the third of 5 intergenerational conversations between young scholar activists and pioneers who over the last 40 years challenged faith traditions to accept LGBTQ people. The next conversations will take place on the following 2 Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Central Time. Before introducing today's honored guests, Rick Peterson from the LGBTQ-RAN board will say a few words about our financial campaign.
Thank you, Doris. Like she said, I am Rick Peterson. I'm the treasurer of the LGBTQ Board of Directors, and thank you from me for joining us today. We are pleased to have this special time to honor Evelyn Torton Beck, Ph.D., better known as Evie. This is our third intergenerational discussion that we've held. Each has been educational, inspiring, and especially fun. There's a rich religious history here that needs to be celebrated, studied, retained, and shared. As the board was planning these 20th anniversary events, we were clear that we needed to remember our past in order to move us into the future. As we celebrate all that LGBTQ-RAN has accomplished over the past 20 years, we also must continue and provide a foundation, the infrastructure to support the compilation and study of this rich religious history. We have set an audacious goal of $20,000 for our 20th anniversary. This will allow us to lay a firm foundation for the next 20 years. I'm pleased to report that we are actually well along our way in achieving this challenge goal. As of last night, we had raised $13,275, almost exactly 2/3 of our goal. This is great, but we still have a ways to go. Our celebratory gala will be held on November 17th, and we are hoping to complete the campaign at this time. I'm now inviting you to join in helping us move forward to this $20,000 challenge goal. You can type giveq.org on your phone or computer, wait a second, and you can direct your gift. You can use the QR code that's found here on the screen, or you can go directly to the LGBTQ-RAN website and hit donate. It's one of those first things you'll find. In addition, there's some great news. You should be aware that we have been incredibly fortunate that an anonymous donor has come forward to match any and all Queering Our Roots contributions made, up to $20,000. That's simply amazing. And furthermore, Ellie Carlton, another incredibly generous benefactor, has made a special contribution specifically to celebrate and incentivize first-time donors to LGBTQ-RAN. All first-time gifts to LGBTQ-RAN will receive an additional match. That means all the contributions from first-time donors will be tripled. So your gift of $25 would become $75. Your contributions of $100 will become $300. I suspect many of you know how remarkable it is, how much LGBTQ-RAN accomplishes on its very small budget. The board and the incredible LGBT-RAN staff, certainly including Doris, are committed to ensuring that our collective religious legacies will be passed on to future generations. Will you please help us make this happen by giving as generous a gift as you can to LGBTQ-RAN? No gift is too small, and I should add, no gift is too large. Thank you for your generous support.
Thank you, Rick. Wow, that was wonderful. Before we begin, I'd like to remind people in the audience that you're invited to submit questions for today's guests on the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And our guests will address as many as possible after the presentation. Well, today we're here to honor Professor Emerita Evelyn Torton Beck. Evie Beck is a Jewish feminist, lesbian scholar and activist who also describes herself as a dancer, painter, widow, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and I will add, author of the groundbreaking, now classic, Nice Jewish Girls, a lesbian anthology. Her book is an early example of intersectionality, bringing together Jewish and lesbian for the first time in book form. You can tell from her description that in all things, she is a lover of life. Evie has chosen to introduce herself during her conversation, but it's my pleasure to point out that last month, she received an honorary doctorate in Vienna, Austria, from the University of Music and Performing Arts, which honored her pioneering role in developing women's studies and lesbian studies, bringing diversity to clinical psychology and healing through sacred dance. She will be in conversation with the young scholar Zohar Weiman-Kelman, professor of foreign literatures and linguistics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, who describes herself as queer, not so binary scholar, and occasional artist, activist, rabbi, and retired Yiddish drag king. As you can guess from the lively descriptions they have for themselves, you are in for a delightful hour. I'm excited to get started, and Zohar has agreed to begin the conversation.
Hi, everybody. So I'm starting. Evie, are you starting?
Oh, you're starting.
I'm starting. I got confused. I am so honored to be in this conversation, honoring your work, Evie, and especially excited because of the archival historical endeavor that we're helping to celebrate and support here. I'm a huge fan of archives and an even bigger fan of the opportunity to have a real life conversation with one of my heroes, and to also be able to exemplify the way our histories are simultaneous and not, you know, one after another. We don't have to wait for the past to go away. We can share in its celebration. So it's really a treat. I am speaking to you now from a silent meditation retreat. Now I'm cheating and not being silent in Israel, Palestine, where I'm from. I'm born and raised in West Jerusalem, and I got my PhD in Berkeley. So originally my immigration was a heterosexual one, but moving to Berkeley in the Bay Area, I quickly saw what else was out there. And I think a formative moment was getting to see Nice Jewish Girls on the shelf at the Graduate Theological Union, where I was taking a course. Yes, beautiful. And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, what is in that book? And I think it was a few more sessions before after class, I went and, pulled the book off the shelf, and really got to see what it could look like to have a lesbian and Jewish identity. And it really was a way in for me to my lesbian identity and queer identity. And having that history has been so significant for me, and even more significant because as a history, it also has led me farther back to the history that I work on of Yiddish women's poetry. I brought my book too. Oh, you have it too. Wonderful. Yes.
I wasn't sure you'd have it with you, so I brought mine along.
Thank you for bringing it. I'm so happy that you have it. And Evie, you've been a reviewer, supporter of this work. And to me, it's just a beautiful example of how rich our dialogue across time and in time can be, and that we can share our love of Yiddish and the past and future queer visions. So that's for my introduction. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Well, I think I'm going to start way back because I've just come back from Vienna, where I guess it was Doris encouraged me to tell this story, where I just got an honorary doctorate for general work, but also because I am a Holocaust survivor. I was born in Vienna, and my family had to flee, and my father was in a concentration camp. And miraculously, my immediate family, the four of us, my brother, my mother, father, and me, escaped, came to the United States. I lost many people in the Holocaust, and had a traditional, relatively traditional, moderate Jewish education. I did learn Yiddish because the Hebrew was taught by old rabbis with beards, and I didn't do very well with those. But the Yiddish, I really did respond to. We had a teacher, and Yiddish really felt that it was a strong, had a female component, if not a feminist component. And so I just wanted to say that my being back in Vienna to get this honorary doctorate was quite amazing. And in between, I came out as an older woman. I was already nearly 40. I had children. I had married a man. So that for me, this journey of coming out has a very rich history, which includes my mother being very, very negative. But then she came forth and came forward. So my earliest work in this was actually through Kafka and Yiddish. So my first book was Kafka and the Yiddish Theater, its impact on his work. But after I came out and did much more feminist work and lesbian research work, I realized that Kafka himself actually was gay. And that was one of my earliest sort of new contributions, besides Nice Jewish Girls, a lesbian anthology, which was feels like the most important work I ever did, it's scholarly in a very different kind of a way. So that's sort of my introduction to myself for the moment, and let's sort of move on from there.
Yes, I'm just turning off my background because I hear that it's can be problematic for people, but I'm having trouble doing it. Okay. I hope that is better for everyone. Wow, Kafka is gay. It's fascinating, and it brings me back to one of the things that we've talked about, which is to talk kind of outside of the topic, but of what does it mean to do things that are not necessarily Jewish and lesbian. Kind of who are you as a full person, as a scholar working out in the world? How does it feel to do other things as opposed to just being focused as a nice Jewish girl?
Well, my whole coming to being a nice Jewish girl, lesbian, came through actually my evolving through women's studies. I was one of the people who founded women's studies, and then within women's studies founded lesbian studies. But we had to come out as women first before anything else. And my whole education was very traditional. We never studied a single woman. I think we read one book through all my Ph.D. I don't think we ever studied any women. Maybe Emily Dickinson, maybe one Virginia Woolf book, but never mentioned that Virginia Woolf was lesbian. I mean, that was just all under the radar. So, so that's sort of my history. And when I came out as a lesbian, I already had a whole scholarly background. Kafka was one of the people that I had studied and discovered the Yiddish influence in his work. And that actually is a parallel to your work, because you brought Yiddish into your work on women. But this was very unusual because Kafka at that time was seen as sort of a disembodied spirit of the 20th century angst. But actually, his roots were Jewish, and now I have discovered his roots are gay Jewish. So that makes him a very different kind of a person within the world. I came out as a lesbian after being married to a man and having 2 children. My daughter was a lesbian before I was. That's very important. In fact, I freaked out when she came out, and then she became my role model, because we did go to a family therapist and he talked with her. And then he turned to me, he said, "She's fine. What about you?" And sort of a light bulb went off in my head. Oh, what about me? Well, the truth is I was a closet lesbian I knew it halfway. Half my head knew it. I thought I was lesbian when I was young, because I never was that interested in men. But when I talked to my first therapist about it, he said, "Do you enjoy sex?" Because by that time I was married. I said, "Yeah, it's okay." He said, "Well, if you enjoy sex with a man, that's it. You're not a lesbian." So it took the lesbian movement and the feminist movement to really bring me out to myself.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, my coming out is so much later than that, but I think that growing up in Jerusalem specifically, in the 90s, still there was really not a lot of queer visibility. There was some, gay male visibility, but that was pretty much it. And so it took, to a large extent, being somewhere with a queer and lesbian community like San Francisco and the Bay Area to really make that seem, possible. And for a lot of things, I think it's much easier to follow in something that you have seen existing. It's hard to imagine possibilities, and I've had a really interesting time with that also, because I spent a lot of time in Poland, sort of partly inspired by attempts to do Yiddish research, and partly because I ended up finding a wonderful lesbian community there that actually was closest to the complexity of my experience, because they were having a hard time, because Poland was very homophobic. Then it got better. Now it's terrible again. But that there was something there about the price to pay that I think in a lot of US context is a thing of the past, but in a lot of the rest of the world, there's still a lot more conflict about it. And by the way, back to Kafka, the Jewish piece in Poland was also such a big piece of that. So to be gay and to be Jewish simultaneously is a kind of double whammy, but also a really rich point of intersection is something that was very significant for my experience, but also from what I've seen in Polish culture. There's something about queerness and Jewishness that really goes very strongly hand in hand there.
Well, what's interesting, as you were talking, I just realized I had to first come out as a woman. I mean, that was my first coming out because I was born in 1933. I'm way, almost more than double your age. And we had no consciousness as women specifically. I mean, I think I truthfully knew I was lesbian when I was young. But as I talked to my first therapist, he said, "You enjoy sex with men?" I said, "Yeah, it's okay." He said, "Well, then you can't be a lesbian." So that was that for a while. And so it took the women's movement for me to come out as a woman, to come to consciousness as a woman. And then within that, I was able to, and my daughter, I should say, my daughter, Nina Beck, she was a lesbian before I was. By the time I came to consciousness, she'd been a lesbian and I had freaked out. So, and then in a way, she became my role model because this therapist that we went to when I was freaking out about her, he turned to me, "What about you?" "Well, what about me?" So I began looking at the world differently. But I became a feminist before I became a lesbian. So my entree into lesbian life was lesbian feminism. And then what led me to create Nice Jewish Girls was the anti-Semitism that I experienced within the lesbian movement. It was also in the women's movement, but I was in those years very, very active in organizing lesbians. And I lived in Wisconsin, which was Madison, Wisconsin is kind of an enclave. But there were a lot of lesbians who came to Madison to our groups who had never met a Jew. Some of them actually said they were taught that Jews had horns. I don't know that they really believed it, but that's what they had been taught. So I discovered there was anti-Semitism within the women's movement and within the lesbian movement. And that was the impetus for bringing together these two identities, which for me at that time were central. And so it was a real opening up of my eyes to the realization the Jewish communities at the time were quite homophobic, except maybe some rabbis from Hillel. I was at the University of Wisconsin where I had gotten my doctorate. My Kafka work was my doctorate work. And then Nice Jewish Girls came after I was a professor, but I didn't have tenure. I didn't know how it would go, but I decided it was more important to do this lesbian feminist work, which is how I identified the work I was doing, trying to educate Jewish people about that being lesbian and gay was okay, and educating non-Jewish people about their anti-Semitism, which they were very unconscious of. Very unconscious.
And I think somehow that legacy is sort of disappeared. I don't know if disappeared, but I don't think I have ever grasped until hearing you describe it right now how tangible and real the anti-Semitism in the women's movement and lesbian movement was. I was more aware of Jewish homophobia and of homophobia in the women's movement, but to hear that the anti-Semitism was real is really important.
They would say things like, "Oh, I Jewed him down. I went to the market and I Jewed him down." Like, I grew up in Brooklyn in New York City, so I had not heard those kind of expressions. And it was really shocking to me, especially since by coming out as a lesbian, it took a while for my family, especially my mother, to accept it. So here I was struggling, with this identity, and then to discover that the place that I thought was my safe haven wasn't really safe, was really quite freaky. That was the impetus for Nice Jewish Girls. The realization that we were, in some ways, we had to educate both Jews and lesbians and gay men. Yeah, so that was a big shock.
So I would be curious to hear then, who the audience was. Did you really imagine writing it for both a Jewish and non-Jewish audience? And what were the responses to it in real time?
Well, actually, I think we put it together with the hopes that it would reach both lesbian communities and Jewish communities. And they were like, I don't know, I think I still have all of the reviews. There were a lot of reviews, close to 100, and many from Jewish presses. So I was pleasantly surprised because the Jewish community at that time was not especially open at all. But the newspapers did, this was what, 82 that it came out. So it was at an early time, it was not okay to be lesbian or gay. I wasn't sure I would end up with tenure. I didn't have tenure at the university. So it was well received by the presses. And I was surprised that, and it made a pretty big impact on people who are neither Jewish nor lesbian. It was one of the first, if you want to call it, intersectional anthologies. We didn't have that word then. That word didn't come into use until into the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century, much the next decade. But it was an intersectional work that other people, both even men, gay men, said, "Oh, I can relate to that. You know, I am Christian and I am gay, and this also, this intersection needs to be addressed." So it was one of the first intersectional works, and it got reviewed quite widely, and I think on the whole, well, so it made an impact at its time that felt good. I forgot, I don't know if I answered your question. You get
Yeah,
kind of caught up in
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That intersection is important. I think it made a big impact at its time. I think it made a big impact beyond its time. It was interesting for me when I was trying to get my book published to see that there's still a lot of work to be done, in the sense that most, Jewish studies, publishing series, etc., were not so open to queer studies. And a lot of the queer studies series didn't quite think there would be an audience for a book in Jewish studies, and specifically on Yiddish. Whereas there's a lot of global queer studies, the Yiddish and the Jewish seemed, I think, less appealing. Not to mention the poetry. No one wants to publish books on poetry, but that's its own sad story. But it is interesting to see that there's a boundary that we keep needing to push. It's not a door wide open. There's no floodgate of intersections in general. And I think a lot of minorities have this issue of really needing to pick one or the other.
The term intersectionality came into use, but actually this was an early example of intersectionality. It came out within a year of the Kitchen Table press, which published, Gloria Anzal, This Bridge Called My Back, and these were like almost at the same time. But the Jewish, actually, there's been, I would say, a certain amount, especially within women's studies, that Jewish identity has become problematic, partially because of Israel, because of the complexity of what it means to be a Jew, of how you identify. I mean, it's never been easy to be a Jew, but where on the spectrum of identity do you place yourself? International politics has entered that in a way that has made it, I think, even more complicated and more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I have experienced that also, specifically, coming from Israel, Palestine, and having this feeling that a certain level of complexity that is just inherent to the situation really doesn't translate well overseas. And it's been complicated to bring all of myself and to do a lot of the work that here we can do. Actually, here, the radical queer politics is more, it's probably the space that is most mixed between, for example, Jews and Palestinians. But that's something that I think we're able to do here and is harder from abroad.
Yeah, I'm not sure. One of the things that I have a little list of things that we think we were going to maybe talk about, and this notion of identity, which is what really started this. I mean, this grew out of, you could say, the beginning of, through feminism, identity politics was a really important issue in the early years of the women's movement. And, first we had to come out as women, right? Because that was something that was kind of hidden. And then suddenly we realized, oh my God, we're not just white women, and we're not just white Christian women, and and the category, we began to understand. And I think we're still struggling in some way with the complexity of what it means to be more than one identity. I think that's one of the things that Nice Jewish Girls did. And it, obviously then there came Lesbian Nuns, a book about that, so I think we're still struggling for understanding our identities. And now, of course, we have LGBT trans issues and issues about, how do you identify and which identity is foregrounded. But Jewish issues have become, I think, very, very complicated because of the world politics. Much more complicated, perhaps, than even lesbian, gay, LGBTQI, as we like to call it. So I think it's not an easy place to go. It was easier when Nice Jewish Girls came out. Okay, we name homophobia among Jews, and we name anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling among lesbians and gays. If somebody says Jew them down, that's not okay. If somebody, calls lesbians, dykes, if they're not choosing it, that's not okay. But it's much more complicated now than it used to be. And I think issues of identity at the time Nice Jewish Girls came out in '82, at that time, that was like the issue really within feminism, because this book really grows out of feminist and then lesbian feminist consciousness. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of looking outwards, but even inwards, we can, talk about different identity struggles, and we're lucky to be friends. But maybe we can share, the story of how we met and some of that context, because I think there's a lot of also internal kind of identity issues. So.
Okay, you start.
I'll start. We'll tell together. It's a story with a happy ending, but I think it was back in 2010 that CUNY was holding a conference called "In America They Call Us Dykes: 1970s Lesbian Lives." I think that was the title, and it was just a beautiful conference set up to celebrate basically, lesbian feminism of the 1970s, and I went very excitedly to a panel that was to be dedicated to Jewish lesbians. And it was, I think, you, me, and Bonnie Morris, who has published the book, The Disappearing L. And I remember our panel fondly. I think you have some other memories, but the conference in general was a very heated site of debate amongst participants, and especially amongst, participants across a kind of generational gap. And it was brutal. I saw a bunch of crying young queers, especially. And I would say, there were tensions around the difference between the use of the word lesbian and the use of the word queer, tensions around trans inclusion, both masculine and feminine. Those are the big ones I remember. A little bit about also use of academic language. So if we can understand that as a kind of class struggle, but it was vicious and fascinating. So I don't know, how do you remember the event?
Well, I remember, I can't now remember what you and I tangled about. No, I agree. A lot of our panel actually was quite good, I thought, and we gave the history of what Nice Jewish Girls was about, and where had things moved from there, because when this book came out, the word lesbian was not mentioned in Jewish communities. I mean, this really was really the first book form that made us visible within Jewish communities. And things have changed a huge amount now because most traditional temples, except for the Orthodox, really will accept and want lesbian and gays participation.
Mhm.
But I don't remember what we tangled about.
Who remembers? But no, I think it might have been around around the use of language. It might have been, though, I'm not
Oh,
especially
yeah.
attached to,
No, I remember.
yeah,
You didn't want to be called lesbian.
yeah. I don't mind it anymore. But I think it was important to me at that point to make room specifically in that lesbian context for queer identities. And it was interesting because what I was trying to say is that to me, and at that point in time, queer kind of held the same, I think, political radicalism that lesbian had, I think, for some of the women of prior generations. And whereas I think some of the older lesbians felt like choosing the word queer was a shift away from politics, to me, it felt a lot more about foregrounding politics and our identity. So that was one of those points where it wasn't even clear to me if we had an ideological difference or just a difference in language.
Language. But of course, we are, I forgot which of the theorists said, we're constituted in and through language.
Mhm.
So language, does have a deep meaning. I see we only have 10 more minutes, so we have to figure out what's the most important things we want to say. I don't remember if I ever said that. Did I say that I discovered that Kafka was gay? Did I say that?
You told us.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Do you want, yeah.
And one of the things that I did and where our work meets is through the study of Yiddish, because I brought in Yiddish as being the woman's language of the time, and you did your work on Yiddish poets. I did my work on Isaac Bashevis Singer, and he's one of the few writers who actually includes lesbians in his stories, but they're always so distorted and so negative that for him they become a symbol of negativity. But we both are interested in Yiddish as a language that holds us as Jews and certain aspects of ourselves as non-religious Jews. At least I consider myself, not a very religious Jew, but a very deeply culturally Jewish person with a deeply Jewish identity. Don't you think that we share that?
Absolutely. I mean, for you also, it's interesting because I think Yiddish has some kind of maybe continuity to something more directly in your past, maybe, if I
I
understood.
went. Yeah, I was sent to Yiddish school as a child.
Yeah.
That's how.
And so, for me, it's interesting because it's both a connection to a past, but it's also about a cut with the past in certain ways, especially growing up in Israel and with Hebrew as my mother tongue. Yiddish for me is about choosing actually the past that wasn't passed down to me. So it, and I think that's part of where Yiddish and queerness work so well for me, is the way in which it's not the language that is dominant even within Jewish society. So it has its own radical charge to it, together with what you mentioned about being a women's language and all this amazing writing by women. That is a treasure. And it's been so amazing for me to be able to have this merger of lesbian history and Yiddish history, because as I was starting to come out, it seemed to me these two things were going to have to be very separate, or I would have to choose between them. But seeing that all of these projects, like the Tribe of Dinah that came after Nice Jewish Girls, that the lesbians were translating Yiddish poetry. Irina Klepfish was writing her own bilingual English Yiddish lesbian poetry. Allowed me to merge not just the Jewish and lesbian, but the Yiddish and lesbian in really surprising ways that feel very at home and I'm just so grateful for that also, because it really is a link in a chain.
Yeah, and I can say that I think Yiddish used to be called the golden chain. I mean that it is a language, but it is also the language of women, and it was the language that was set aside as being less than Hebrew. So it's interesting that it's lesbians. I think you say in your book that lesbians have done a great deal with Yiddish as a mama lush, and it's called the mother tongue. So it may not be that anymore for Jews of our time now, but it is it is called in Yiddish the mother tongue. And I think that that's, for those of us, not everyone has Eastern European roots, so I don't
No, of
want to
course
be
not.
exclusive, but within this country, and Yiddish itself is from Eastern Europe, and so those are the roots. That's why it's the mother tongue. So feels really good to make this bridge between us and between our continuing work.
Yeah. And I think also it's beautiful, not just, we have all these very literal bridges, but I also think of them as a kind of model for other, say, minority Jewish languages, Jews of Arab descent, for example, or Ladino, the idea that that we have to think a little bit differently in general about continuity, and kind of queerly that we can pick and choose what we want to pick from the past and continue, and who we want to pick from the past, and your daughter has a lesbian mother, you have a lesbian daughter, but in some ways I think we're also creating our kind of alternative lines of kinship, and we get to kind of choose who our foremothers will be. I can choose you. You exist. It's amazing.
Yes, and it's wonderful. I'm very happy to have you in my life and to meet once again when we're both more grown up. Then it feels like, even though I was already very old, I'm more mature now than I was.
All right.
And that it feels very good. And my daughter is, she's a nice Jewish girl. She did right, but it was hard. I have to admit, it was not easy for me to accept her as a lesbian. But she became my role model, and I think that these are important things for us to recognize. But Yiddish is in some ways the queer language of the Jewish world. In some ways, because it was the language that was relegated to women, and it was the language that was not in the higher echelons. So, I think that that's really, really important, and I think it's important for us to continue to bring forward Jewish, lesbian. I'm worried, truthfully. It's one of the, I know we're close to the end. I want to say that the word lesbian is being erased and disappeared, because I think it's like the equivalent of women being disappeared from a patriarchy. I think within the larger LGBTQ community, I think the word lesbian needs to be preserved. Some people can call them, we can have a spectrum of names, but lesbian has to remain there. Otherwise, we'll be disappeared the way women get disappeared. That's my take.
That's your tease. I support that. I also, want to make the case though, to make sure that, when we say lesbian, it is, the most inclusive possible term for lesbian. So trans inclusive, and that now we know what could have been forgotten, that lesbians come in all shapes, shades, and colors, born different ways, and that's definitely worth preserving. And are we out of time, or do we have? I wanted to ask where your things are archived. That was where is all of the material? Is there background material from Nice Jewish Girls? Is there?
There is, and I should put it into some archive. I haven't yet done that. By the way, whoever it was, Irene, can you also put Nice Jewish Girls, a lesbian anthology, in this thing so people can get it? It's out of print, but they can get it secondhand on Amazon or whatever. So I just want to make sure, because that's the Kafka and the Yiddish Theater is important, but for this discussion, Nice Jewish Girls is more important. And that name, by the way, was very radical in its time. It doesn't sound radical anymore, but you have to understand that to put lesbian with Jewish in 1972, when this book first came out, 82, when this book
82,
first
yeah.
was a very radical step, very, very radical move.
No,
Well,
and I think it holds also really the kick that the book has, because it's naughty and nice at once. It really says it all.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for sharing the joy of engaging across generations, as well as frankly discussing touchy issues as they arise. If the audience has questions for our guests, please enter them in the chat or Q&A box. And both guests have agreed to stay a few minutes after the recorded session for an informal chat on Zoom with any interested participants. So there is one, and I think you actually covered it. Dina Leibowitz asked, she says, you know, lesbian queer isn't just a matter of language. And she asks, and I think this might be directed to Zohar, can you speak to how the queer movement relates to feminism?
Well, I don't also know that there is necessarily a queer movement, because it's very probably dispersed movements, but I would say a kind of queer approach to politics is inherently feminist, absolutely, in terms of seeking justice and equality. But I would say the point of view might be slightly less binary or exclusionary than we might think of feminism at its worst. But I would say queer is feminism at its best, or that when we work well together. Because I don't associate feminism in any way with something that should be exclusionary of anyone. But I would say feminism doesn't have to be queer, but queer politics have to be feminist. How's that for a short answer? That's my short answer. That the politics are the same. Maybe it's easier to see queer as talking about a desire to free us all of gender policing, and to use feminist tactics to protect everybody who is harmed and damaged by gender inequality. And so that would be a short answer to a very big question.
Well, there's two things, but I think before that, I just want to share one of the comments came from, let me see if I can get this, Jeff. Oh, shoot. I'll get his name as soon as I move this box. But he remembers Evie very fondly. You were a guest speaker in Washington, D.C. in
I remember that.
Yeah, when Miss Pacha, did I mispronounce that? DC's LGBTQ synagogue hosted a large nationwide LGBTQ Jewish conference for 350 people. Barney Frank wasn't out then, but he was the keynote speaker. He must have been on his way out. And this Jeff led services on that Friday night when you spoke, and has continued since then working on LGBTQ affirming prayer books. And I'm sorry I got the name wrong. It's Larry Neff. So very nice to hear. And then Magid Elias Raymer would like to know what you're both working on now.
Go ahead, Evie.
Well, I'm actually, I've had several different lives. I became a psychologist after I became a professor of literature and women's studies. And now I'm actually doing something called Sacred Circle Dance, in which I'm integrating dances of many different cultures. And there are, it's a really work in bringing a kind of a sense of common humanity to people through dance and moving together. So it's a group that has very good politics, but we do it through movement. And I've written 2 things already about phenomenology of this dance and how it, and we dance, I dance in a synagogue, which probably has, it's not a Jewish group, but it has an impact, I'm sure, that we dance in a synagogue that supports our dance and my lesbianism. I'm the only lesbian there. So, and what are you working on, Zohar?
Ooh, I want to dance.
Me too.
Next time when we're not on Zoom.
That was how we made our best connection. After
We danced at the dance at the social of the lesbian conference. It was beautiful. I am working on sex in Yiddish now, actually, especially on sexology. So the science of sex, which I started at because I was working on another wonderful woman poet, Celia Dropkin, and her poetry is very dirty, kind of a lot of sadomasochism. And then I wanted to know, how can I learn more about the historic context of sex as it was spoken of in Yiddish? And then I found all these weird science books that discuss sexuality in Yiddish. So I'm kind of interested in it for the vocabulary, but also for the approach of really how did Jews talk about themselves to themselves in Yiddish. So that's what I'm working on.
Wow.
It's fun.
Well, what I want to say is that we need probably a day to talk, Zohar, not an hour.
It's
We
true.
have so many other topics that we could be talking about.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. And thank you again. If anyone would like to talk informally with Evie and Zohar, please just stay on the webinar after a few words from Rick Peterson.
Okay.
Again, thanks so much. What a great discussion. I so much appreciate it. Just a reminder, we have a $20,000 campaign goal. I think we're going to meet it, but we need your help. We made contributions easy. Again, give q.org or use the OR, and remember that your donations will be doubled through an anonymous gift. And if you're a first-time donor, they will be tripled. Your donation will be tripled. So this is just a fantastic opportunity. And again, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, in closing, I'd like to invite everyone to the October 23rd. Oops, I better wait. Conversation posthumously honoring the decades of courageous leadership of Archbishop Carl Bean. Reverend Paul Anthony Daniels will talk with the current leader of the Unity Fellowship Church movement. That's Bishop Zachary Jones, a wonderful leader. In the final conversation will be November 3rd, and the author Matthias Roberts will interview Troy Perry, founder of the Metropolitan Community Church. You are joyfully invited to the culmination of our 20th anniversary celebration in an online gala, November 7th. I hope you will join us live, but sessions will be recorded and available on the LGBTQ-RAN website, which I hope everybody will come and spend some time seeing how much we have available.